Welcome back to OmniUpdate, where we decode the critical military strategies and geopolitical flashpoints that define our era. Today, we are focusing our attention on a tiny 40-mile strip of land in Eastern Europe that holds the terrifying potential to ignite World War III. Situated along the border between Poland and Lithuania, this unassuming corridor is known in military circles as the Suwałki Gap. To the west lies the heavily fortified Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, and to the east sits Belarus, Russia's closest military ally. This unique geographic reality has turned the Suwałki Gap into NATO's ultimate Achilles heel. Geopolitical analysts and military commanders in Washington and Brussels have long identified this choke point as the most dangerous place on Earth, where a single miscalculation could force a direct, catastrophic confrontation between Russia and the combined forces of NATO. Today, we are going to break down exactly why this remote corridor is the subject of intense, around-the-clock monitoring by the Pentagon, analyze the terrifying scenario of a Russian land grab, and explain why the security of the Baltic nations is fundamentally dependent on these 40 miles of territory. To truly grasp the significance of the Suwałki Gap, we have to perform a deep dive into the strategic geography of the region. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were once part of the Soviet Union, but are now sovereign nations and members of the NATO alliance. However, they are geographically separated from the rest of NATO's European allies by this narrow strip of land. Currently, if NATO needs to move heavy armor, logistical supplies, or reinforcements from Poland into the Baltic states, they must utilize the few roads and single railway line that pass through the Suwałki Gap. Now look at the Russian perspective. Russia has its critical outpost of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. This exclave is home to the Russian Baltic Fleet, advanced S-400 missile systems, and nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. However, Kaliningrad is a military island, completely surrounded by NATO territory with no land connection to the Russian mainland. During periods of peace, Russia has negotiated access through Lithuania, but in a conflict scenario, Kaliningrad becomes isolated and highly vulnerable. For years, Western military strategists have feared that if tensions boil over, the Kremlin would solve two strategic problems at once by launching a simultaneous military operation from Kaliningrad and Belarus to capture the Suwałki Gap. The immediate consequence of such an operation would be the creation of the Kaliningrad Corridor, a direct Russian land bridge connecting Belarus to the Baltic Sea exclave. This maneuver would not just be a territorial acquisition, it would be a total strategic checkmate against NATO in Eastern Europe. The moment Russian troops seize control of the Suwałki Gap, the three Baltic nations are instantly cut off. Their only land connection to their NATO allies is severed. This would render NATO's enhanced forward presence battalions in the Baltics completely stranded, unable to receive heavy reinforcements or supplies through Poland. While NATO maintains naval and air superiority in the Baltic Sea, the deployment of Russia's sophisticated anti-access, area denial, or A2AD systems in both Kaliningrad and the captured Suwałki Gap would create a formidable defensive bubble, making naval or air rescue operations incredibly risky and costly. The entire region would effectively become a Russian military zone, leaving the Baltic states vulnerable to total occupation. We must analyze this scenario through the lens of NATO's founding principle, Article 5. This collective defense clause dictates that an attack on one member is an attack on all. If Russian or Belarusian forces, even disguised as paramilitary groups or local insurgents, seize the Suwałki Gap, they are launching a direct invasion of NATO territory in both Poland and Lithuania. This instantly triggers Article 5, forcing the United States and all other NATO members to respond militarily. We would be witnessing the scenario that the world has dreaded for 80 years, a direct hot war between the world's two largest nuclear superpowers. NATO commanders would have only two options, and both are equally terrifying. The first option is a desperate attempt to launch a massive military offensive through Poland and the Baltic Sea to break the Russian blockade and reopen the gap. This would involve thousands of US and allied troops fighting against entrenched Russian forces, leading to catastrophic casualties on both sides and a rapid escalation of the conflict. The second, and far more terrifying option, is that the conventional battle for the Suwałki Gap could quickly spiral out of control. If Russia, finding itself losing a conventional war against NATO's vastly superior forces, decides to utilize its escalate to de-escalate doctrine, it might deploy tactical nuclear weapons against NATO formations or critical military infrastructure in Poland. This scenario would leave Washington with an impossible choice: to retaliate with their own nuclear weapons, potentially initiating a global strategic nuclear exchange, or to back down, effectively breaking the NATO alliance and shattering the post-World War II security order forever. This is why military planners do not view the Suwałki Gap as a typical border. They see it as the single point where conventional warfare in Europe transitions into a nuclear apocalypse. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the strategic calculus surrounding the Suwałki Gap has become even more volatile. On one hand, NATO has taken aggressive steps to reinforce its eastern flank. Plans were finalized in 2023 to expand NATO's Rapid Reaction Force from 40,000 to over 300,000 troops, with massive stockpiles of heavy equipment pre-positioned across Eastern Europe. We have seen specialized U.S. airborne divisions conducting intense, realistic training exercises right near the gap, simulating the rapid deployment scenarios that would be required to hold the corridor. Furthermore, the historic accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has fundamentally altered the security of the Baltic Sea, turning it into a NATO lake and theoretically making it easier for NATO to supply the Baltic states by sea. However, we cannot underestimate the Russian response. The Kremlin views NATO's expansion and increased activity near its borders as a direct existential threat. In response, Russia has announced massive increases to its defense spending and plans to create new military districts facing NATO. There are ongoing, credible intelligence reports that Russia is quietly prepositioning specialized special operations forces, electronic warfare systems, and massive ammunition depots inside Belarus, specifically in regions that could easily support a push towards the Suwałki Gap. While Russia's conventional military power is currently heavily degraded by the war in Ukraine, they have shifted their doctrine to rely even more heavily on their nuclear deterrent and hybrid warfare capabilities. The Pentagon's intelligence apparatus is constantly monitoring for signs that the next major Russian offensive might not be directed at Kyiv or Kharkiv, but at this quiet, 40-mile strip of land. The Suwałki Gap is not just an obscure geopolitical curiosity, it is the absolute epicenter of NATO's defense strategy. If NATO cannot hold this corridor, it cannot defend the Baltics, and if it cannot defend the Baltics, the very premise of Article 5 and the entire credibility of the Western Alliance collapses. The 40 miles of territory separating Kaliningrad from Belarus are currently the thinnest line between global peace and a devastating, direct war between major superpowers. The decisions made in Washington, Moscow, and Brussels regarding the militarization of this gap will dictate the security of the 21st century. We will continue to monitor the satellite imagery, analyze the military exercises, and track the shifting power dynamics on NATO's eastern flank. The mainstream media may be focused elsewhere, but we refuse to look away from the places where history is really being written. We want to hear your brilliant strategic assessment on this critical flashpoint. Do you think NATO is doing enough to reinforce the Suwałki Gap? Or is Russia simply waiting for the perfect opportunity to cut off the Baltic states? Let us know your analysis in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into military strategy and geopolitical risk valuable, please hit that like button, share this video with your network, and ensure you are subscribed to OmniUpdate with all notifications turned on. Thank you for watching, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next update.